There is a photograph that exists in the mind of anyone who ever watched him play. The fist, clenched tight, pulled toward his chest, the red shirt unmistakable against the green. The crowd behind him, tens of thousands of people, roaring with a sound that didn't just fill a stadium, it filled something inside you. Tiger Woods was never just a golfer, he was a feeling. A force of nature compressed into a human frame, walking fairways like someone who had already decided how the story would end. But even the greatest stories have chapters nobody anticipated. There is something quietly devastating about watching a man who once seemed untouchable begin to feel the weight of everything his body carried for him. It doesn't happen loudly. It doesn't arrive with a single announcement. It comes the way winter comes slowly, then all at once. And by the time Tiger Woods moves through his 70s, the life he built across decades of dominance has begun shifting in ways that are harder to watch than any loss on any leaderboard ever was. What happens to a man whose entire identity was forged in competition, when competition begins to slip away from him? What happens when the sport that gave him his first language, the only language he ever fully trusted, starts to go quiet? These are not comfortable questions. They are the kind that sit with you after the screen goes dark. This is not a story about failure. It is not about scandal. It is something more tender and more difficult than either of those things. It is the story of a man in time, of greatness and its cost, of what remains when the roar finally, slowly begins to fade. To understand what any of this means, you have to go back further than the trophies, further than Augusta. You have to go back to a small boy in Cypress, California, who didn't choose golf so much as golf chose him, before he was old enough to have a say in the matter. Eldrick Taunt Woods was born on December 30, 1975. His father, Earl, was a Vietnam veteran, a man who had seen the worst of what the world could do and come home carrying something he couldn't quite put into words. He found his peace partially on a golf course, and when his son arrived, Earl saw something in that boy that went beyond a father's natural love. He saw a destiny. He believed it with his whole chest. Tiger's mother, Kultida, came from Thailand, a woman of quiet, deep strength who shaped her son's inner life in ways the cameras never really captured and the headlines rarely honored. Earl placed a golf club in Tiger's hands before the boy could form complete sentences. There are home videos of this that feel surreal to watch even now, a toddler swinging with a precision and natural form that simply should not exist in a child that small. Tiger appeared on national television as a prodigy. Audiences watched with their mouths open, not quite knowing what they were seeing, only knowing it was something they had never seen before. Behind all of it, a father was pushing, guiding, shaping. Earl believed Tiger was not just going to be a great golfer, he believed his son was going to change the world through the sport. That is an enormous thing to place on a child's shoulders, and Tiger never buckled under it. He straightened. He carried it forward, quietly and completely, as if he had been born already knowing it was his to carry. He turned professional in 1996, just 20 years old. Within a single year, he stood in a green jacket at Augusta, having won the Masters by 12 strokes, a margin so impossibly large that it didn't just win a tournament. It rewrote the conversation about what was even achievable on a golf course. A young black man with a Thai mother, standing at the summit of a sport that had not always made space for people who looked like him. The world paid attention in a way golf had never experienced. New faces in the galleries, new conversations at dinner tables, something shifting quietly in the culture of the sport itself. What followed across the next 2 decades belongs in a category of athletic achievement that very few humans have ever occupied. 15 major championships. Years, not weeks, not months, but years spent as the undisputed best golfer on the planet. A cultural presence that extended so far beyond sport that his name became shorthand for excellence in fields that had nothing to do with golf. Sponsor deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. A foundation that quietly changed thousands of young lives, giving scholarships and opportunities to children who had never imagined golf as something meant for them. But underneath all of that, underneath every title and every record and every standing ovation, the body was working, absorbing, accumulating. And the body, no matter how exceptional the person inside it, has a long memory and a final word. What people sometimes forget, or perhaps never fully understood, is that Tiger's greatness was not something that came naturally and effortlessly. It was something he built piece by piece with a ferocity that bordered on frightening. He did not simply practice golf. He approached training like a soldier preparing for a war that never fully ended. He lifted weights in an era when most professional golfers treated the gym as an afterthought. He studied opponents with an intensity that made them uncomfortable just being in the same room. Every variable he could control, his breathing, his nutrition, his sleep, his mental state. He controlled it, weaponized it, put it in service of the game. Former caddies and longtime colleagues have spoken over the years about what it felt like to be in Tiger's orbit during tournament weeks. Focus doesn't quite cover it. He was somewhere else entirely, present in body, but locked into a version of the competition that existed only inside his own mind. It was remarkable and at times a little unsettling to witness. The results of that commitment still feel surreal when you sit down and actually look at them. His 2000 season alone, a single calendar year in which he won 3 major championships and came within one tournament of completing a calendar Grand Slam, is considered by many who have spent there live studying the sport to be the greatest individual season any golfer has ever produced. He was 24 years old. For the better part of a decade, the entire professional golf world organized itself around a single question, not who was going to win, but whether anyone could stop Tiger from winning. More often than not, the answer came back the same way. No, his personal life in those peak years had its own carefully constructed appearance. He married Lynn Nordegren in 2004. 2 children, Sam and Charlie, followed. From any external vantage point, it looked complete: the compound in Florida, the yacht, the family portrait that matched the professional one in its apparent perfection. A life that seemed designed by someone who had gotten every detail exactly right. But the most solid-looking structures can carry invisible fractures. And in late 2009, fractures that had been invisible became impossible to ignore. The end of the marriage became one of the most exhaustively covered media events of that era, spread across every platform, every tabloid, every camera that could be pointed in his direction. Sponsorships vanished. The image he had spent years constructing cracked open in full public view. He stood before cameras and said words that no speechwriter could have made sound anything other than raw and exposed. Whatever any individual felt in that moment, sympathy, judgment, or something more complicated than either, nobody could quite look away. And then, with the quiet stubbornness that had always defined him, he tried to find his way back. Golf returned. But it returned differently than before, and the difference was written in his body long before it showed up in his scorecard. The back pain appeared gradually in the early 2010s. It didn't announce itself as serious at first. Pain rarely does when it's trying to take root somewhere permanent. It whispered during practice, it faded. It came back slightly louder the next time. Then louder still, until eventually it wasn't whispering anymore, it was saying something that couldn't be ignored. By 2014, the surgery had become unavoidable. Then another surgery followed. Then more. According to various reports, the total number of spinal procedures Tiger has undergone across the span of his career has reached a figure that makes medical professionals pause when they encounter it. The human spine was not designed for the particular kind of rotational force that a professional golf swing generates. Repeated thousands upon thousands of times across decades of competition at the highest level, something was always going to give. It was physics. It was inevitable. It was just a matter of when. He missed long stretches of competition. He slid down world rankings in ways that felt genuinely impossible. This man who had occupied the summit for so long, now absent from leaderboards entirely. There were tournaments where the discomfort of simply walking the course was visible on his face, no matter how carefully he tried to conceal it. There were rounds where his expression told a story his words refused to confirm. The question that had always felt unthinkable started being asked, quietly and then openly: was this the end? And then came 2019, and Augusta, and a moment that nobody who witnessed it will ever completely find the right words for, against the surgeries, against the years of struggle and absence and doubt. Against the quiet but growing consensus that his best days had passed permanently into the past, Tiger Woods won the Masters tournament, his 5th green jacket, his 15th major championship. He fell to the ground near the final hole, and his son Charlie wrapped around him, and the image mirrored with an ache that was almost unbearable. Old photographs of Earl holding a young Tiger in exactly the same way, on a different course, in a different lifetime. The world watched and felt something it had not felt in a very long time. Something that sat somewhere between joy and relief, and the particular kind of emotion that comes when something you had quietly given up on comes back to life. But the body, through all of it, was still keeping its own private account. February 23, 2021, a road in Rancho Palos Verdes, California. A single vehicle accident that sent everything sideways, in every sense of that word. Tiger's SUV left the road traveling at significant speed, struck a median, crossed lanes, and rolled multiple times down an embankment. Emergency responders had to use specialized tools just to get him out of the vehicle. According to reports from medical personnel involved in his care, the injuries to his right leg were of a severity that, in many cases, ends athletic careers completely, and in other cases, threatens outcomes far more serious than a career. The world held its breath. Genuinely, collectively, he survived, he kept the leg. But the recovery, by all accounts from those close to him, was the most physically punishing experience of his life. And this is a man whose life had already contained surgeries and recoveries that most people would consider extraordinary by any measure. Months in a hospital bed, months relearning how to walk, months of deep uncertainty about whether there was any version of a future that still included the game he had been raised to love. He came back to golf slowly, selectively. He appeared at events, walking with a gait that had changed not dramatically, but noticeably in the way that only the people who had watched him for decades could quite name. The swing was still there, still unmistakably his, but the body carrying that swing was older now and heavier with everything it had been through. People who watched those appearances described a complicated emotional experience: pride, genuine admiration. But alongside it, an undercurrent of worry, the kind you feel when someone you care about is clearly pushing through something they shouldn't have to push through alone. A quiet ache for a man who loved the sport so completely that he seemed unable, or perhaps simply unwilling, to let it go, even as it became harder and harder for him to stay. There is something specific and well-documented that happens to elite athletes when the arena begins to pull back from them. It is not dramatic. It does not make the front page. But it is real, and it has shaped the later chapters of many extraordinary lives. For Tiger, golf was never a career in the conventional sense. It was, according to those who knew him closest, identity itself, the structure of his mornings, the meaning of his weeks, the internal measure he used to understand his own worth. Earl had raised him to be the best golfer who had ever lived. Tiger had delivered on that more completely than almost anyone had thought possible. But the framework that delivery depended on, the competition, the scorecards, the pursuit, the roar, had begun slowly to loosen its hold. What fills that space? What does a man reach for when the thing that gave his days their shape starts to recede? He is, by every account, intensely private. He does not open the interior of his experience easily or often or to many. That privacy protected him during the years of dominance. It gave him a shell that competition couldn't penetrate. But privacy in the slower, quieter seasons of a life can shift its nature. It can become something that insulates rather than focuses. Something that holds a person apart from the very connections that might help them find their footing in unfamiliar territory. His children have become, visibly, one of the most significant anchors of his current life. Charlie, who carries not only his father's interest in golf, but a recognizable thread of his father's natural talent, has appeared alongside Tiger in events designed for parent and child together. Watching them in those moments is something that resists simple description. Here is a man watching his name and his legacy and something of his very specific genius move forward in another person, his own child. There is unmistakable joy in it. Genuine and unguarded in a way his competitive years rarely allowed. But if you watch carefully, there is something else present in those moments too. A particular kind of awareness that settles into people when they understand, clearly and without denial, that time is moving, that certain things are ending. That the hands that held a golf club before they could hold a pencil are holding it now for different reasons, in a different season of life. As Tiger moves deeper into his 70s, the conversation around him has grown into something that extends far beyond sport. He has become a lens, a figure through whom people examine larger questions about what greatness requires of a person, about what we celebrate in our athletes without ever fully understanding what it costs them, about how we construct heroes and what those heroes are left with when the construction is finished. He gave everything. He reshaped his swing not once but multiple times, each time not for comfort, but for competitive edge, asking more of a body that had already given more than most bodies are ever asked to give. He returned from injuries that would have permanently ended most careers. He returned from public exposure that would have finished most public lives. He returned from grief. His father died in 2006, and those who knew Tiger well have said, carefully and consistently, That the loss of Earl never fully settled in the way that grief is supposed to settle. It stayed somewhere close to the surface. The physical accounting of all of that is visible and documented. But the interior accounting, the psychological weight of building and losing and rebuilding an identity so completely tied to a single pursuit, is harder to see and possibly more significant. In rare interviews, carefully controlled and brief, he has spoken about legacy, about his children, about what golf has meant to him beyond the competition and the titles. In those moments, a kind of softness emerges that his years of dominance almost never permitted. A man becoming visible in ways the champion was not. That is beautiful, and it is heartbreaking in almost equal measure. There is a specific kind of grief in watching someone who seemed built for endurance begin to feel the limits that time places on every human life eventually, without exception. It doesn't feel fair. It never does, but fairness was never the agreement. What Tiger Woods did to golf is not a matter of opinion. It is measurable: attendance, television ratings. The number of children who picked up a club for the first time because they saw someone who looked something like them standing at the top. The culture of who feels welcome in a sport that had not always extended that welcome widely. All of it shifted in the wake of what he did. He was a catalyst for something that outlived every individual trophy and every individual season. But he was also a son who lost the father who had defined his entire sense of purpose. A father trying to be genuinely present for his own children, in a way that the consuming demands of his career sometimes made difficult. A man who anchored so much of his identity to a single pursuit that, as that pursuit softens at its edges, he is being asked to rebuild something fundamental: the understanding of who he is when the game is no longer the answer to that question. That is not a small thing to be asked of anyone. In many ways, it is harder than anything that ever happened inside the ropes, harder than any comeback, harder than any surgery. The internal work of learning to age with some measure of grace, when grace was never what the world rewarded you for, when the world loved your ferocity, your refusal. The look in your eyes when you refuse to lose. What does a man shaped by all of that do with stillness? What does a morning look like when it doesn't begin with a target? There are no tidy answers. And maybe the absence of tidy answers is exactly the point. Tiger Woods, like every person who has ever burned at that particular intensity in whatever arena they were given, is doing now what is perhaps the most ordinary and most profound thing any human being ever does. He is living inside what he has built, inside the cost of it and the meaning of it and the uncertainty of what comes next. The competitor is still in there. The fist pump lives somewhere underneath all of it, patient and waiting. But there is more to him now than the version of him the world memorized. There is a man, private, complicated, resilient in ways that go beyond sport, figuring out who he is in the quiet, figuring out what remains when the crowd has said its last thing and gone home. And somehow, carefully, that version of Tiger Woods may turn out to be the most important one there ever was. If this story settled somewhere inside you, let it stay there for a moment. The victories matter, but what they cost and who the person is underneath them matters just as much, maybe more. If you have something to say about Tiger, about legacy, about what we owe the people whose greatness we consume without always asking what it takes from them, the space below is for exactly that. This conversation is worth having slowly, and if stories told this way speak to something in you, stay close. There are more of them waiting, and they all deserve to be told right.